It's lovely to be here. My name's Luke Allen. I am a member of the consulting engineering organization at Jamf. I've worked at Jamf for the last 2.5 years. It's gone very quickly. Prior to that, I took a year off. I thought it would be a really cool time. Like, I worked at Apple for 8 years, and I thought, oh, it'd be really cool to take some time for myself. And I wanted to work on apps and games for myself and just take 12 months or so to do that. I did that 3 weeks before the pandemic started, which is the best time in modern history to quit your job. Absolutely fantastic. So I am going to talk to you guys today about offboarding the security blind spot. So I would say, hopefully, you will think it's fair to say that offboarding is one of those things that is rarely discussed, and that's because it tends to come last. So anytime you speak to any kind of touch point in the Apple community, whether that be somebody at Jamf or whether that's somebody at Apple or somebody in the reseller community or the consultants network or whatever that might be, most of the time spent is on the kind of upfront customer experience. So let's talk about the first user's moments on a machine. Let's talk about plugging it into your identity provider. Let's talk about making sure that the apps the individual needs are there. And then we turn to look at the admin experience and we talk about, hey, how is software update working? I came up to my machine and there was a prompt for me to do the latest software update, so amazing. Hopefully it doesn't turn off while I'm presenting. And then we talk about things like patch management and security and day-to-day and things like that. So one of the things that people often then tend to forget is, what about that offboarding experience? So hopefully what I am encouraging all of you to do today is to be a bit introspective. We're going to keep it fairly high level, actually. There was a different version of this talk that I gave that was very esoteric and very deep, and I think that that's still valuable, and I would like to do something like that, but maybe that's something like JNUC, where we go hands-on and I get you guys to dig around in the terminal and stuff. But hopefully you will all leave inspired to go away and do something different in your own organizations. So, this is the end of the deployment. We've got our smiley face children now. We're going to boot them out of the company. So, like I said, there's often a perception that there's less value in shaping the offboarding experience. And actually, there's a few different reasons why you might want to focus on the offboarding experience, and there's a ton of different reasons. Some of them will be specific to you as an IT admin, and some of them will be specific to the user. Just to call out a few of them, it's a reflection of your company brand, very much in the same way that you sweat the details from an onboarding perspective. It's also good to be mindful of the user's last moments on the machine. So one of the things to be mindful of in terms of brand and things like that is that the last moments on a device in your organization is probably the last moments that they're going to have within your organization, and that lasting memory will probably stick with them. So if it's painful, they'll remember it. If it's not, then you've done a good job. And of course, unless somebody's particularly hateful, you probably want them to come back to your organization. You hope that they go away, they learn some stuff, and then they come back. So that's one of the main reasons. I mentioned earlier on about kind of talking about onboarding experiences, and if you have ever worked with anybody from Apple or anybody from Jamf or anybody from the reseller community, you will know that there is a really big encouragement to have people to use Apple IDs on the device and kind of maintain that consumer experience, that out-of-the-box experience. So it would be a good idea to allow people, if you've encouraged that behavior, it would also be really nice if you allowed people before the end of the deployment to be able to extract some of that data. And some of you, depending on your background, might be kind of scratching your heads at the moment thinking no way. But I will cover that in a second. The user might have corporate data on the device. And one of the things I'll touch on in a moment is things like end user license agreements and agreements that you have with your users when they onboard the devices. There may be financially sensitive data on the machine. There may be corporately sensitive data on the machine or IP or something like that is resident on the machine, and it's good to be mindful of that before you do anything like erase it, for example. And that might land on your shoulders depending on what happens in the organization. So I will give you a real example of this that's happened in the past with me, and I want you to think about what would happen if you were in that scenario and what you would have done. So this is what we're going to cover. Why should I care? What happens if things go wrong, and that's the bit that you'll probably care about. What Jamf and Apple tools are at my disposal to be able to control this and to be able to craft a nice experience that is not only mindful of security and introspective and gives you guys a bit more information about what's going on the machines during someone's final moments, but is also a good user experience too. And then some tips for success. So if you don't currently have much of a process in place today, how you can go away and start to take these building blocks and do some of this stuff yourself. So I don't have very long. We could truly spend, I don't think anybody's going to feel any different about this, but we could this is a really huge topic. Like my colleague Misha van der Bent did a talk at JNUC 2019 about user offboarding, and he took it in a completely different direction. He was talking about the physical act of like taking a device, erasing it, and then handing it over to somebody else. And there is a ton of complexity in offboarding, and it can be taken in a ton of different ways, and it very much will be specific to your vertical, to the size of users that you support. Like, there are people in this room from education, from financial services, from government, for like high security. Some people do 10 devices, some people do 10,000. So what's going to be right for you is going to be different depending on your organization. So again, a few other things just to mention. I'm going to focus on macOS specifically because of the nature of macOS being a bit more open. If you look at me not wanting to talk about iOS and iPadOS or user enrollment, which is Apple's kind of BYOD stuff, the reason I'm not going to focus on that is simply because, one, I've not got that long, and two, the way that Apple ID works on the devices, it's much more explicitly tied to your personal content, and the separation between the device at the end is a lot more clean. Whereas on macOS, many things are tied to Apple ID, but not everything is tied to Apple ID. So there could be situations in which data could be living on the device that, if erased, just disappears. Just out of interest, be bold. How many of you just erase the machine at the end and that's it? We're all good, all done. Cool. Seems reasonable. Yeah, there's nothing wrong with that. Like I said earlier on, it depends on your vertical, what you guys do, and all those sorts of things. But there are some reasons that you might be interested to think about it. So over the last couple of years, like, I've spoken to a load of organizations that have got a really relaxed approach to data. And I think a lot of organizations have had to modernize their approach to this because of the pandemic. So more than ever, people are working from home, and lots of organizations where previously they had people doing lots of things locally, lots of data lives locally, they've had to condense their 5-year, 10-year plans to move things to the cloud, whereas now lots of organizations are using things like Dropbox and Box and 365, and lots of stuff lives in the cloud implicitly rather than more stuff living locally. So I think people are getting better at this, but that's something to absolutely be mindful of. Secondly is financial impact. So financial impact. So like I said earlier on, depending on who this person is in the organization, there might be something on the machine that you'd like to retrieve that's sensitive or important or valuable for your organization before this person disappears. And then finally, like I said earlier on, if you've encouraged people to personalize their devices, it might be a good idea to allow them to remove some of those things. People get very prickly like porcupines when you tend to destroy photos of their kids on the way out of the organization. So let me give you a real example about what happens when things go wrong. So the thing that I'm interested in to think about where we're going to take this is user offboarding within the context of security and data loss prevention. So This is the bit where I want you to all think about your organizations and what you do and supporting your users and things like that. So this was not at Jamf, and you've heard my previous working past. I won't say which company it was, but I did say the two companies that I worked for at the beginning. So it was a former company that I worked for, and some customer called me up and said, hey, it was not somebody that I would regularly deal with, it was somebody else. And they messaged me, and it was very vague, and they said, please help us. We really need to get access to this machine. So I kind of went back and forth with them, and they were very cagey. And eventually, they told me that they had found some very senior person in the organization who had been caught leaking corporate secrets or financially sensitive information to a competitor, and they were getting reimbursed for it, like paid for it. So they wanted me to help them understand what tools they had at their disposal to be able to physically gain access to the machine. So they had it in their possession, like they weren't a big Apple house, they were kind of more Windows focused than anything else, so what tools did they have at their disposal to be able to extract that information? So, I don't know if you can't see that, lovely. I talked to my team about it, and we came up with some ideas about how we were going to respond. So I thought this would be a really fun exercise for me. So I bet you're all thinking about what tools you would use. I'm mostly thinking, like, this is going to be awesome. We're going to put this guy in prison. It's going to be really fun. Unfortunately, for both me and this customer, the only thing that actually we were able to do is for me to spend time chastising the customer for not having a plan in place in the first place. It turned out that in this case, the second that they had found this out, their legal department notified the IT department, and the IT department erased the machine, which was not great. So unfortunately, in that situation, we weren't really able to help the customer very much, except to say, here's how you shouldn't do this next time. So with that in mind, I bring you back to the title of this talk. So I think that security blind spot might be a little bit of a stretch. That is the name I was given from our marketing department. But I do think that having a good security-focused review of offboarding and how you handle devices from that perspective is probably a really sensible thing to be thinking about internally. So let's start at the end. People will leave. So it's good to be mindful of that fact. So people are going to leave for all sorts of reasons. Some people are going to serve notice periods, and they will gracefully leave the business, and they'll leave on good terms. Some people might leave under disciplinary reasons, and they're gone tomorrow. And an individual's relationship to the machine on their way out of the business will will massively depend on what that experience from them leaving the organization is, whether it's a positive one or a negative one. And I'm sure that most of you are never going to be in that position where you're going to have to receive a phone call from the legal department and immediately respond. But hopefully some of you are sat there thinking, I know what we've got a plan. It's written down. How many of you have a plan? All 4 of you. Great, excellent. So let's have a look at what tools you have at your disposal. And of course, you'll all notice the Jamf logo in the corner. So obviously, this is going to be a little bit Jamf skewed. So I'm going to look at this from a Jamf perspective. So if you are using Jamf Pro or Jamf Protect, there is a lot of cool things that you can be doing. And like I said, I'm going to keep this kind of high level because I know that we have lots of different people from lots of different backgrounds in here. But if you are interested to talk to me about this in any kind of depth, I would be very interested to do that afterwards, so please come and find me. So let's start with Jamf Pro, and we will keep it truly high level to start with. So I'm sure most people in this room have heard of smart groups, but it's worth talking about this up front because when you start thinking about offboarding for the first time, there are a lot of things that probably don't occur to you. So one of the really sensible things that you should be doing when you are building your offboarding experiences is think about automation. So one of the things that we have inside Jamf Pro is a thing called smart groups. And the idea is that we can assess your devices based on a whole load of different criteria. It's really fantastic for things like deploying apps or for deploying software updates. So for example, if I want to find all the Intel machines in my organization that are running on the latest version of the operating system and don't have the app, I can build a smart group for that and then dynamically assess all of the machines in the organization. And as they drift into that group, I could apply that application, and when they've got the application, they will drift back out. So one of the things that you could be doing here to save yourselves a lot of time, money, and stress is to have all of your offboarding experiences already crafted, all the scripts that you want to run, any nice UI that you'd like to pop up, any additional policies that you want to put in place, have all of that stuff built, tie it to a smart group, and then all you've got to do is when somebody from HR messages you to say, hey, Chris is leaving the organization next month. See Chris. All I got to do is stick Chris's device into this group, and that's it. I'm done. My job is finished. In a different version, you see this in the screenshot, in a different version of this talk where I was going to take it in a bit of a different direction, you can see that obviously you can get really creative when it comes to building these experiences. And whilst I'm looking at this from a security perspective, it is really important to be mindful that this should be like a user-led experience. It should be a good user experience. And one of the things that I threw together that was really, really simple, it took me 20 minutes to put together, was just a script, Jamf helper, throw up a UI with a couple of dialog options which just says, hey, we know you're leaving the organization. It was a script that walked the file system, pulled up all the files that weren't managed files. There wasn't anything that was put there by MDM, and then threw a document on the desktop that had a list of all the files and a link to organize a meeting with somebody from the IT department so that if they needed any help removing the stuff from the device, you could do it on a Zoom call with somebody, and it was really, really simple. Probably a contentious one for this room. Coughs and silence, so not contentious. Standard users, you should probably be deploying standard users where possible. There are fewer reasons than ever before to kind of make everybody blanket admin users, and we've already heard from other people on this stage talk about privilege escalation tools and things like that. In a minute, I'm going to start talking about Jamf Protect, which will probably be something a lot of you either haven't heard about before or are a bit more unfamiliar with. But one of the things that's quite nice with Jamf Protect, for example, is if you're using like the Privileges app or something like that, we have custom logging filters that plug into unified logging so that anytime anybody elevates their privileges, we can push all of that up into a seam tool, and then you have a lot of visibility to like when people are lifting their privileges to admin, how long for what reason. And in a minute, when we start looking at what you can do with Jamf Protect around user offboarding, one of the things I should have said up front was there's going to be a lot of different, in fact, I won't do it just in case I mess things up, but one of the things I should have said up front was from an ethical and legal perspective, I'm going to be making some suggestions that I'm telling you what tools you have available rather than thinking about kind of whether it is an appropriate thing to be deploying to users. Some of the things I'm going to talk to you about, you wouldn't necessarily suggest to be deploying to users all the time because they're a bit invasive. But if you know somebody is leaving the organization in the next 2 weeks, maybe you'd like to raise the visibility from an admin's perspective and get a bit more data about what they're doing on the machine so that you have a bit more visibility from a security perspective. If you think back to the individuals from earlier on, if they were using File Vault, and I'm sure most of you are at this stage, but still you would be really surprised how many people who are predominantly Windows-focused individuals who are coming to the Mac for the first time and coming to Apple devices for the first time don't know anything about File Vault, don't set File Vault. Please set File Vault. I don't feel like I need to say more than that, really. And I think this, like if you do nothing, if you don't build anything at all, if you just decide that you're going to not bother and you plan to just let people leave the organization, erase, and carry on. At least know that one of the best things that you can do if something does go wrong is remote lock. So one of the ways that you can do that is send a command to the device, put a PIN code on that device, put a custom message on there, and at least it gives you a bit of time to breathe and then think about what it is you're doing. So the way this works is it will log the user out. Even if the user is an admin, they still can't boot into the recovery partition. Short destroying the device physically, this is probably going to be your best bet so that you've got a bit of breathing room and you can figure out what you want to do next if you do find yourself in that position that those other guys did earlier on. Just out of interest, that organization isn't here, is it? Are they? Put your hand up if you feel brave. Somebody put their hand up. Up next, the last thing before we move into Jamf Protect is I was actually having a conversation with somebody earlier on about this stuff, and they were saying that when it came to user offboarding, this was like one of the most painful elements for them, which is that they continually find that they're erasing devices at the end of an individual stay at the company, and depending on how they do it and depending on whether they let the user do it or not, they may or may not find that their activation locked at the end, which causes a little bit of friction, just a little bit more work for people. So having people opt out of this themselves and encouraging people to do things themselves is always going to be much simpler, and then they can't blame you for destroying those pictures of their children. So, to summarize that section, smart groups, file vault, make sure that you're deploying standard users, and then we'll talk about some of the cool things in Jamf Protect. So if you've never heard of Jamf Protect before, Jamf Protect is our endpoint security tool. It has things like malware detection, with the ability to quarantine the malware so that you can kind of go back and figure out how it got there. We will report on suspicious behavior. So for example, if somebody if somebody takes their keychain and then dumps it to the desktop, whilst not inherently a terrible thing, that is a little bit suspicious. So you'll be notified of those sorts of things. And then we have things like phishing protection that uses DNS resolution to make sure that it's a legitimate link that the individual is trying to access. Normally, when we talk about Jamf Protect, we think about it in the context of kind of day-to-day security. If you start looking at it from a end-user kind of offboarding perspective and gaining a bit of visibility within an organization and kind of lifting the profile of security within your organization, it becomes a really interesting tool. So you can get a ton of information about what a user is doing as they leave the organization. And most people are altruistic, they're never going to do anything wrong, but it is really nice to be able to have that extra bit of security in your back pocket when people are leaving. One of the other things to mention, of course, is that you can also pair all of these sorts of features and workflows along with things in Jamf Pro. So it gets to be really powerful when you start crafting those offboarding experiences. You can automate a lot of that stuff and make it really simple and pleasant as well. So in this example, you can see I appreciate some of you can't see this. HR flagged that you intend to leave the business in the next 14 days. As a result, this removable storage device is limited to read-only. If you wish to back up your personal data, please email us. So one of the things that's really cool in Jamf Protect is the ability to be able to control external media. So if an individual is leaving, perhaps you dump them into that smart group, it applies this behavior to the device and it prevents them from connecting an external media device. You can, of course, go a little bit further than that. So, for example, in your organizations, if you provide people with external media and you know the serial numbers, you can do whitelisting of serial numbers so that it will just allow those devices. You could just allow them to be mounted as read-only, for example, or just apply or just approve specific brands. And, of course, once this happens, you customize the message and also tie that back to scripts and things like that. So Again, being able to just control that experience to close down an avenue to prevent people from removing stuff from the machine at the end of their way out. If people start taking stuff and sticking it on a drive, you have complete visibility to that and control. From an admin's perspective, you also get a ton of visibility and information on this. So you can see things like the IP address of the machine that tried to do this, a useful timestamp. You can, of course, stream all of this stuff into a SIEM tool. So if you are managing multiple environments at massive scale and you're using something like Sentinel, or if you're using Splunk or something like that, all of this stuff can be pushed straight up there. And of course, one of the things that's really awesome about this stuff is, again, like I said, you have the ability to push this into Jamf Pro and then have things happen as a result, which is quite nice. So think about more generally, if we look at it more broadly outside of user offboarding, if you're just interested in this feature and you want people to be using drives that are encrypted, you could have someone mount a drive. It's not encrypted, so you then open up self-service and provide them with a script to encrypt their drives, for example. So one of the other really powerful things that we have in Jamf Protect is the ability to build custom analytics. So out of the box, we have over 150 different analytics that we provide for you, and they're the sorts of things that I mentioned earlier on. So they're a mix of looking for known malware, suspicious behavior, and reporting on those sorts of things. When it comes to offboarding, the thing that's really cool here is that you can build something that truly fits your organization. And so, for example, if you wanted to monitor a specific file for read-write, you could do that. If you wanted to, in this example, anytime the user invokes the sudo command in the terminal, I've basically just got it set so that it will report on those sorts of things. And as you guys can imagine, once you start building these custom analytics inside Protect and scoping them to machines, you can have it set so that when somebody leaves the organization, you just have that bit more information about what people are doing on the way out of the organization. To give you a bit of a closer look at what that looks like in the UI, and of course, like I said earlier, all this stuff can be streamed into a SIEM tool. But in this particular example, I appreciate you may not be able to see it, but we get some really useful information, like which user was logged in at the time, which command was run, so you actually get the name of the command, the IP address of the machine, other useful things in there, and it ultimately depends on what analytics that you guys are writing and running. But as you can imagine, when you start to put this together with the expectations of your organization, and you start to automate all of this stuff, it becomes incredibly powerful. So a few years ago, I'm sure some of you have seen lots of interesting talks from people over the last few years about unified logging, but a few years ago, Apple changed the way that they did logging more broadly across the operating system as a whole. And one of the things that not enough people take advantage of in Jamf Protect is the ability for us to set custom logging filters. So anything that you can pick up on in the logs, you can kind of pick up on and report back into one of your SIEM tools. So one of the examples from an offboarding perspective that I will throw up on the screen might be to report on something like AirDrop. So this is a kind of a condensed version so that it fits on the screen, but you can see in this example that I basically used a unified logging filter to focus in on the sharing process in macOS, and in this particular example, I can see Luke's shared a corporate secrets.zip file from his computer, and that sounds very suspicious. Of course, that's one example, but you have the ability to write custom logging filters for anything that you can pull out of the logs across macOS. So when you start thinking about what that means, that's incredibly powerful, and there's a lot of visibility. And you'll cast your minds back to when I said that I'm suggesting things that aren't necessarily ethical or legal in some countries, like depending on where you are, but like this sort of stuff could be appropriate maybe for the final hours of somebody on the machine or the final day, and it ultimately depends on where you sit in terms of what your organization feels is appropriate based on the fact that it is ultimately a corporate resource. So we have done a lot of heavy lifting for you already. So I've got colleagues in this room that regularly contribute to our GitHub repository. So if you are a Jamf Protect customer and you're not using this already, we have a ton of different unified logging filters already written, a ton of different predicates in there that you can use. It's a really useful place to go and have bookmarked if you are using this technology today. A few things I want to leave you with, because I'm sure some of you are sitting there after I gave that example of this organization that panicked and had a big problem, and you're probably thinking that you need to solve this problem quite quickly. A few tips for success. Firstly, you need to buy Jamf. And that's it. Thank you very much. When I've worked with organizations in the past, this is like one of the biggest things. So working with the broader organization, like you guys are, like the people who aren't working for vendors and resellers and things like that, you are IT admins, right? So you don't have to do this on your own, and it really shouldn't ultimately fall to you, because I'm sure that you need to get legal involved, and you need to have a look at your end user agreement that you put up in front of users during the onboarding and things like that. Especially now that people are working more remotely than they ever have done, and people aren't necessarily coming to offices, and their relationships with the machines have changed. Now is a really good time to revisit those kind of end user agreements if you haven't done already. Make sure that it holds water from like both a legal perspective and from a HR perspective too, and that it's relevant for 2023. Also, from a HR department, I bet that not many people in this room get any kind of notification around somebody leaving the organization. So if somebody's handed their notice in, I bet that a lot of you, I saw somebody go like this. So yeah, one of the things that would be really great is to get friendly with your HR department and see if you can get them to loop you into this process to understand how important this really is. If you think of the customer example that I gave a little bit earlier on, if your organization needs a process like this in place, it would be very good to have it written down, to have somebody that owns it, to go through it regularly to make sure that it still makes sense. If you were an organization that were very good at this and did this from an Intel perspective, and then Apple brought out M-based devices, your process might significantly have changed as a result. So it's very good to continue to revisit this annually and to continue to have a look at what you're doing and make sure that it still makes sense. Also, if you're not doing so, use things like Appleseed for IT to make sure that you can test on upcoming versions. I see people nodding, which is fantastic. Like I said earlier on, the pandemic has forced a lot of organizations to get good at this, but ironically, if you're not one of those organizations, then you probably don't have this either. So maybe it's more important for those organizations, but it's a really good time to modernize your app strategy, and I would encourage that if you work for a large organization to engage your CIO on this activity, because if you share that example I gave earlier on of that anonymous customer, that's probably really going to resonate, and it's a really good reason why things should be living in the cloud, and you have a more modern approach to people working remotely and at scale. One of the other things that's really nice, I've seen this done, Jamf does this, which is really good, but it's to set expectations around what will happen. So if I decide, like, hey, I've had enough of Jamf, and I'm going to hand in my notice, I shouldn't have to, as a user, get to the point where I've handed in my notice to understand what the offboarding process should look like. That you should just have that like on your website somewhere internally so that people can understand what that should feel like, what that's going to look like. The other organization that I worked at also did a very good job of that too. And then one of the other things is to understand the personas in your organization. So I think this audience is probably very good at that. But like I said earlier on, depending on who you are in your organization, you should probably be a little bit more interested to deploy some of these tactics than other places. So for example, if you've got somebody who isn't necessarily inherently technical in their job and they don't necessarily need to be, then you're probably going to have different level of concerns over somebody who is, your lead developer who absolutely knows the Mac inside and out and is constantly one step ahead of you in terms of getting out of management. And of course, timeless advice, because everybody in this room is doing this. If that company earlier on had been using any kind of backup service, which they absolutely were not, they might be in a different scenario right now, and that guy would have been in prison. Next time. So when it comes to data loss prevention and security and things like that, people have cameras, people have pens and paper. So ultimately, you can build a huge offboarding process, and you can make it very technical, and you can watch everything that an individual is doing, but at the end of the day, I have to say it because I said it. So tech isn't always the answer. Human behavior and process matter, not just meat touching glass. Hopefully that didn't undermine my whole talk as well. And with that, thank you very much for being a lovely audience. I think I've got like 3 minutes if anybody has any questions. Gentle questions.
Great talk, Luke. This is exciting stuff. It's not the most exciting, right? I mean, this is the kind of stuff that we need in case of emergency, break glass.
Absolutely.
In a lot of these cases. So when you're planning your thing with the HR department, because that's who needs to be involved, if for no other reason than legal protections for the organization and you, the employee that works there, what kind of things do you recommend talking about with those HR departments? Because I know that you really have to have the difference between John won the lottery and we're never going to see him again, and Ted, that evil bastard, gave away all our secrets. Now what?
Yeah.
So what other kind of considerations do you have to have in your workflows?
It's a very nice question. Thank you for that. I think having spoken to a few different organizations about this, I think the thing for most people in this room to be mindful of is that the people that you're working with from a HR perspective are so far removed from this. Like there was a healthcare customer that I used to work with, and they wanted my input on how to build a good acceptable use policy. And I entered the room with those guys, and they had done the right job, and they'd gotten legal there, and they'd gotten HR there, and everything. And the only thing they wanted to talk about was no porn on the machines, no porn on the machines. Like that was the only thing that they cared about. When actually, I think from everyone in this room's perspective, it is more about lifting it up and talking about, like, look, depending on how you've done this in your organization, people are going to have a personal connection to this machine, and there is a corporate connection to this machine. And trying to convey to the other stakeholders in the room that you need to have a bit more maturity around, it doesn't matter what people are ultimately, does depending on where you come from, but it doesn't matter what people are doing on the machines. They're going to behave on them or they're not, but let's make sure that we have a policy in play which is clear and fair, and if we are encouraging people to put things there and personalize the devices, that we should honor that on the way out too and provide people with the opportunity to take stuff off with them, rather than just nuking the machine like an hour before they leave or whatever. Sorry, that's fine too. Cool. Anything else? Anyone else? I'll replay it if you.
I want to ask, how do you deal with immediate offboardings? Because it's nice if you get XYZ days. And yeah.
How do you deal with immediate offboarding?
Yeah, and I mean, HR might send you a notification like a month, depending where you're based, US or Europe. You get some sort of timeline for the offboarding, but what happens? Like we've seen different, I don't want to say tech companies doing layoffs, but yeah, like what would have been the process be?
So to bring it back to the former question, I really do think it's key to, there was two things. I think it's really key to make sure that you have an individual in place who is like the go-to for this, that knows the tech inside and out, so that if something happens, they can drop everything and make it work quickly. But also, I think part of that previous question was around making sure that like the stakeholders in the room understand what's on the line here. So if somebody does, if I decide to slap my laptop shut and walk out the door, like I'm done. Knowing that could be a possibility and ensuring that information gets back to the right people as soon as possible, and making sure that the people in the room, like whether it's HR or legal or whoever, understand what potentially is on the line, depending on whether, it ultimately depends on what organization you come from too, right? If you come from like UK government, you probably care much more deeply than you do if you're maybe an education customer. Maybe that's presumptuous of me, but I think it will ultimately depend. And that's one of the reasons why I actually kept this quite high level, is because when you start delving into a bit more esoteric territory, you then tend to isolate different sections of this room. So hopefully people find it useful. One person. You work for the company too, so. Be quick, William, is what I heard.
Yes. That's what I felt as well. So how do you feel about offloading a lot of the offboarding to people like the HR department, etc.? So Jamf Pro's got an API, whatever Salesforce or whatever the hell HR system you've got might have an API. Do you feel that the benefits of allowing the HR people to trigger an action or trigger a process is worth it, or where do you feel the risk-reward boundary lies?
That's a very generous question, William. Thank you for that. I'll thank you for that later. My honest answer, I mean, there's a more nuanced answer, and to be respectful to the people here, I've already gone on for ages, but I'll give you a more nuanced answer later, and anybody else who's interested, but my glib, I'm going to leave the stage now answer is, that depends. Yeah, I think it depends on your organization. Like, I mean, for you guys, it would be an interesting conversation to have, but maybe it depends on how much you trust your HR department. Who trusts their HR department? Anyone? 1, 2, 3. 3 people. So maybe that answers the question for you.
I think so.
Cool. Thank you very much for listening, everybody.